Okay, so thank you everybody for being here. Please be sure to take some time to view the virtual exhibition. The link, you can see it on the screen. Type this in the address bar and it'll take you directly to the show. The virtual show will be followed by a physical exhibition at the Livingston Parish Public Library in Springfield, Louisiana. So be looking for more information on that if you follow me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, those kind of places. I'll be posting some information about that there. As we go ahead and get started, I am going to block out my screen so that you can pay attention to the presentation and not me. And we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Peter Klubeck. I'm an artist and a librarian. I mention it because for me, the librarian aspect and the artist aspect are all part of one big perspective that I primarily communicate through my art. To truly understand what my imagery is about, it's important to know where I'm coming from and what I'm doing in terms of my thinking. Here in this slide, we see three different examples of the type of work that I do. This includes trains, faces, and plants and landscapes. What we're going to look at today primarily and what we're going to be discussing is railroads and railroading. So here's what we're going to do and discuss today. First, we'll look at the cultural aspects of railroads and trains. We'll get some terminology settled and see where I'm coming from. You'll have a better understanding. Then we'll take a look at some of my images and learn how railroad culture has shaped my approach to this topic. And then we'll pause, we'll deviate for just a moment, just a tiny break, if you will, and talk about libraries. At this point, this may seem odd, but you'll understand it more once we're there. I think that it's critical to understanding the full story of me and my work. So we'll talk briefly about libraries. After that, we'll come back and look at some more art, and then there'll be time for some questions. Okay, so there are many books, articles, and resources written about railroad culture, railroading, railroad people, and the history of railroading, etc., all that kind of stuff. But one of my favorites is the H. Roger Grant's book, Railroads and the American People. And conveniently enough, this is a great place to start. So, one of the things that he presents is how the towns and cities that dot the American landscape were often designed or built up around the railroad. A very common layout for a town is for the tracks to run right through the middle, sort of cutting the town in half. And we're going to talk more about this later once we're looking at the art. But this design has been largely shaped by the railroads themselves. Grant added that some towns even picked up and moved from their original platting. They sort of reoriented themselves to accommodate the railroads. They actually picked up and moved in order to work better for the railroad. He also explained that many towns grew from the railroad at important junctions, trading, or mining operations. This developed in the same way that earlier towns had formed around bodies of water for ports, harbors, etc. Something else that Grant wrote about was how the railroad generated jobs and created workplaces for people across the country. You know, it's not uncommon for someone to see my work, my artwork, and remark that they have a relative that worked for the railroad. I had a cousin, a brother, a father, a grandfather, etc., etc. It's a culture and a way of life that ties a lot of people together. They don't often think about unless they are reminded by something like one of my paintings. In this book, Grant also wrote about businesses and companies that grew up in support of the railways, not just the railroads themselves, but businesses and industries that supported the railroads. And one of my favorites is how he details the Harvey House restaurants. In the early days of railroading, dining cars didn't really exist. So in the late 1800s, the mid to late 1800s. So when a steam locomotive needed to stop to take on water and refuel, passengers would often disembark. They would go to what was called a Harvey House, which were started by Fred Harvey. And they would usually go and get a well-prepared meal, a meal like that they could have at home, like a home-cooked meal, which you wouldn't normally have on the train. So they could relax, they could stretch their legs for a bit. And from this model, they expanded into Harvey House Inns, where people could actually stay overnight. Today, the Fred Harvey Company still exists, but after several buyouts and mergers, they never went bankrupt themselves. They never got bought out. But after several mergers and buyouts of other companies, they changed their name and they're now called Xanterra Parks and Resorts. Interestingly enough, they purchased the Grand Canyon Railway in 2002. So they do still have a tie to the railroad. So Grant also talked about how railroads created a sense of community. He wrote about how railroads offered communities an opportunity to connect, move away from feelings of being isolated. He described how many communities viewed railroads as an opportunity for prominence, particularly if they'd been passed over during the construction of canals or when other state and territorial institutions had been established. So, if you think universities, county seats, large hospitals, all those kinds of structures, railroads basically represented a way for towns to create a sense of identity. He described how when a railroad was built through a town, it became a spectacle. And he detailed how many festivals and events developed and revolved around the marvel of the railroad as it kind of came to town and built things up around that. Okay, so Grant provides us with some context for how railroad culture has been shaped and developed. But this has also been reinforced by railroad branding. Railroads will adopt a logo, colors, and slogans that represent their culture and the communities that they serve up and down the line. They also develop unique architecture for stations, switch towers, and other structures along the right of way, which adds to the feel and familiarity of a community, the buildings within the community, the people that live there. And all of this helps people form a tie and identity around a particular railroad. You can ask any rail fan what their favorite railroad is, and they will have a ready answer for you. It's kind of like pick your poison. What's your favorite railroad? This art exhibition is also built around these ideas of color, texture, slogans, and identity. So we're going to look at a few photos and see how this all applies. In this image, we have the Union Pacific, one of the oldest continuing railroads. It was the Union Pacific that was responsible for the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. This railroad is characterized by the yellow, red, and gray colors that we see here. They've also had many slogans over the years. Their current slogan is Building America, but they have also had "We will deliver," "We can handle it," lots of different slogans. Be specific, ship Union Pacific. So they have definitely played with their identity and their branding quite a bit. This is the Louisiana and Delta Railroad. This is a local line here in Louisiana. Their colors are those of the parent company, the Genesee and Wyoming, seen here with the orange and the black. I actually took this photo. I took this photo in New Iberia, Louisiana, which is also the railroad headquarters for the Louisiana Delta. There's a few images that we're going to look at related to my artwork that relate to Louisiana Delta. So kind of keep these colors and these images in your mind when we go forward. Okay, so those are some samples of railroad colors, which is part of my work. But the title of the show is Weathered Patched Heritage, and this is meant as a reflection on the phases or processes that railroads go through with their identity. They have these colors in their locomotives and equipment, but they're out in the weather. They get rained on, they get snowed on, mud and dirt and dust build up on the surfaces. Basically, they get dirty, which is what we describe as weathered. And this example of a locomotive, it's a Chicago Northwestern locomotive. This is a great example of what a weathered locomotive can look like after years of service. And here we have a close-up of another locomotive. This also demonstrates weathered with the rust and the discoloration. You look at a lot of weathered machinery, railroad equipment, it gets rusty, the edges get kind of jagged, the original paint gets faded. Those are all examples of weathered. So after weathered, we have patched. This is where one railroad will take over another one, or locomotives is sold to another company. They will quickly try to put their colors, logos, and identity over that of the other. We can see in this example, the Union Pacific is taking over the Southern Pacific. It creates a sort of patchwork appearance, hence the term patched. You can kind of see the Union Pacific shield placed over the SP. You can barely make out the S on the nose of that. You can see how the number is yellow versus the gray of the background. So it gives it this patchwork kind of feel. Here's another example of patched. You can see how another company put their logos all over that of the Union Pacific. We've got the WAMX down here. We've got their logo on the nose. You can see how they scratched out Union Pacific on the side. So it's not just Union Pacific that's kind of putting their identity on equipment of other railroads. It happens to the Union Pacific also. And so finally, we have the term heritage. And this is where a railroad will start to get introspective. They take a look at where they have been, the different companies and identities that have made them up, and they kind of resurrect those colors from earlier railroads. They kind of want to get that nostalgia feeling for those different companies and railroads that are now a part of them but used to be independent. Here we have a Union Pacific locomotive in the heritage colors of the Katy Railroad. The number 1988 is meant to reflect the date of that acquisition. So the Katy became part of Union Pacific in 1988. This is an example of a heritage unit. You can see kind of over here on this side, the Union Pacific logo. You can see how it says UP 1988, UP everywhere. They still want you to know that it is Union Pacific, but it's covered in kind of a MKT or Caddy Railroad logos. Now let's look at some of my paintings. This particular image is from 2020, and whenever I do an exhibition, this one included, I like to include a painting from my previous body of work to demonstrate the continuation of my story. Kind of like when a show will provide a summary of a previous episode before a new one. So like on the previous episode of Star Trek, on a continued episode, they'll recap what had happened in the previous episode. That's kind of the idea here. So looking at this, this is coincidentally another great place to start. Again, this painting is based on colors from the Louisiana Delta, which we looked at earlier. In 2020, I was collecting people's stories. Mostly, I was collecting stories about COVID and people's experiences during COVID times. But this was a story about a guy who had worked on the Louisiana and Delta Railroad. He talked all about the locomotives he used to work on and could describe them in detail by unit number. He would go on and on. Let's see, we had the 1708, 1709. We didn't have 1710. We had 1711. And he knew these locomotives inside and outside because he was a mechanic and he worked on them. He added, though, that they all leaked oil. It didn't matter which unit you were talking about, which is the title of this piece. They all leaked oil. Ultimately, it's a reflection of the structure of the railroad, the machinery, and the identity of those who work on them. So this painting is called We Will Deliver, and this one is called Building America. Both of them um, deal with the Union Pacific. They're very similar. As we look at these two images, one thing that people often ask me is why I tear, rip, and cut the edges of my paintings. There are many reasons for this, depending on the image being generated, whether it's faces or trains or plants, but mostly I find that few things in life are perfect. Everything and everyone is a little bit broken in one way or another, and I feel like this kind of reflects that idea. For railroads in particular, and especially the Union Pacific, which again, this is what this image is about, they're made up of individual pieces and parts. Some parts come from other railroads, other pieces come from government contracts, all are pieced together by the people that make up the whole of the railroad. They work on the railroad, they maintain it. It's about the people. So, in some way, I think that this represents a more complete image of the whole based on individual layers, pieces, and parts. Additionally, I think the tears speak to the variety of textures that form during the rust and weathering process. So these images also look at the idea of weathered. They speak to the story of where railroads are and how they keep on despite their rough appearance. So that idea of weathered also carries over into this image. This painting is called How Tomorrow Moves. This is the slogan of the CSX Railroad, and here I'm using their corporate colors in the composition. You can see the blue and the yellow of the locomotive. But there's also rust colors and hues from the weathering process. The textures are included, and the idea of moving directly is also examined. If you spend any time in a railroad yard, and I have been to a few, you will see moving trains, but you will see far more cars sitting still. Whether it's the siding for repairs or transfer, there's far less movement in a railroad yard than a phrase like how tomorrow moves would suggest. So I like the idea of the phrase contrasted with the textures and shapes of the freight cars not moving. It speaks to the story of the railroad, the identity forged by the company, and the reality of what is happening on a railroad at any given moment. So those ideas are carried over into this image, which is titled www.cnca, which is not a slogan, it's a website, but it's what appears on the side of locomotives belonging to the Canadian National Railroad. Their use of a website as a slogan appeals to my understanding of the World Wide Web, the global supply chain, and how railroads fit within that overall picture. Railroads have also historically carried with them a notion of modernity and speed, something that can be tied to the internet, websites, technology. You think speed when you think of all those things. So this all combines in this image to tell the story of the 21st century railroading. This image is called KCS lines. This is a pretty significant image, and it uses colors from the Kansas City Southern Railroad. You can see kind of the yellow and the gray of the locomotive in the background. But I am also working with the idea of weathering. I have the rust colors, I have the textures, same ideas that we've looked at before, the freight cars, different layers of paper. But I have these bars running down the page. And so this image really tells the story of how railroads can split a community. I talked about how railroads can shape the design of a city or town, and it's not uncommon for one side of the town to be less economically stable than the other. If you think about the phrase other side of the tracks, that kind of comes to mind. People can feel locked in or imprisoned by their economic status, with the railroad forming the boundary of the prison or the jail to which they are locked inside. The point is driven further with the text that's actually woven into this image. So within this image and all the others, you may have noticed the text in the previous ones. I like to include layers of different pieces of paper. Some of these are pages from books, discarded books in the library. I mentioned at the beginning I'm a librarian, and this is where that piece kind of comes into play. Some of my favorite pages to use in my work come from law books or legal reporters. And this is because the law applies to everything and everyone, and I often find a way to weave that into the story I'm sharing with my images. So here I have incorporated the pages from a housing lawsuit filed based on redlining practices. This adds another layer of meaning to this image that ultimately looks at identity, how communities are formed, and where those boundaries within those communities exist. Okay, so since I mentioned libraries, here's where we're going to pause and look at libraries for just a skosh, just a little second. This moment is critical to gaining a full understanding of what my paintings are all about. So we'll get back to the images in a second, but first let's look at this rhetorical question that I like to pose. What is a library? As a librarian, I've met a lot of people who that really think they know what a library is. Um, they have them in grade schools. There's public libraries. There's way more public libraries than McDonald's in this country these days, a fact which I like to tell people. But there are many people who would define a library as a warehouse for books. I'm sure you've all heard someone say that libraries are irrelevant. We have Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. We don't really need libraries anymore. To that, I would say that libraries are not about books. And they probably haven't really been about books since sometime in the 20th century. There are libraries being built right now that do not contain a single book. Here's one such example. This is the Florida Polytechnic University Library, and they do not have a single book. You can see on this interior image how they have a lot of computer terminals. The exterior view, um, you can kind of get a feel for what the structure looks like. They rely heavily on ebooks and electronic databases. If you absolutely need a book, they do have an interlibrary loan department. They can get that physical book from some other library somewhere else, but they really emphasize the electronic resources. They want you to try the ebooks and the databases first before you try for a physical book. Here's another example. This one comes from the Contemporary Art Library, and they don't collect any books either. Um, if you look at their About page, they preserve art history from our time through ephemera, electronic exhibition material, and individual works of art. So again, they're building a collection without actually including books in that collection. This example comes from the Pigment Library at Harvard. Again, no books, just the raw stuff of information through color. I provide these examples, these three different examples, to demonstrate that libraries are not really about books, but rather they're about information in all its forms. The information could come from an electronic book, a painting, or even a vial of pigment, which we're looking at here. So why is this all important? I think it's important because as a librarian, I value information in all its forms, and I view my work through the lens of information. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I'm telling my story basically using that idea. The layers of paint are combined with layers of texture, words, and concepts, all adding up to what I say is a more full rendering of the subject. So with that description, with that thought of libraries, let's go ahead and look at some more work. This piece titled Patch captures the layers of locomotives and rail equipment that have been repainted, rebranded, and repurposed over time. The concept of patching extends beyond simple weathering or wear. It represents an intentional act of erasure or transformation, where one railroad will impose its identity over another, often leaving behind traces of what once was. These remnants, faded logos, mismatched colors, hastily applied markings, we saw some examples earlier. To me, they tell a deeper story of change, dominance, and adaptation. This speaks powerfully to the concept of identity, revealing how visibility and obscurity coexist in a single form. The scars and overlays on these machines are not just physical, but symbolic, illustrating how history is rewritten while fragments of the past still persist. Layered within this particular image are documents from the Surface Transportation Board outlining the full merger of the Southern Pacific Railroad into that of the Union Pacific Railroad. I find that this adds to the already complex story of shifting identities. This image is titled Heritage Katy. It's the first of my exploration into heritage locomotives. And again, this is locomotives painted to honor the railroads of the past. I'm particularly drawn to the paradox within this practice. Railroads are often quick to erase the markings and identities of their predecessor lines, patching over the history in the name of progress. Yet later, they deliberately resurface that same history in a kind of commemorative gesture. This act of revival functions almost as a mask, and here the Union Pacific adopts the identity of the long-absorbed Katy Railroad, attempting to don its colors and symbols. You can see how the Union Pacific locomotive is kind of wearing a mask over it with the Katy image. The Union Pacific adopts the Katy Railroad. Layers of identity raises questions about authenticity, nostalgia, and kind of the way we curate history. The additional layers of text embedded within this piece come from a land dispute that took place in Katy, Texas. The legal history intertwines with the visual language of the locomotive, reinforcing the idea that railroads do more than move goods and people. They actively shape the landscapes, economies, and identities of the places that they traverse. I think that's very important. By incorporating these textual elements, the work underscores the complex relationship between transportation, land, and the contested narratives of ownership and place. This work, titled Heritage Penn Central, kind of continues my exploration into the paradox of heritage locomotives. The story of the Penn Central has always fascinated me. The Penn Central was formed from the ill-fated merger of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad, two longtime rivals with very different corporate structures. As I mentioned, rail fans will have a favorite railroad. When it comes to the Pennsylvania and the New York Central, you're either in one camp or the other. The Pennsylvania fans aren't New York Central fans, and the New York Central Railroad fans are not Pennsylvania fans. But then these two merged together, two very different companies with very different ideas. The union, as you can imagine, was doomed from the start. There was internal conflict, logistical incompatibilities, and financial mismanagement. Within just 2 years of the merger, Penn Central collapsed into bankruptcy, which was one of the largest corporate failures of its time. This image visually captures that unraveling history. The heritage locomotive is depicted with layers peeling away, which reveals glimpses of what came next. Though subtle, beneath the Penn Central livery, you can see traces of blue, which is Conrail, the company that rose from the ashes of Penn Central's failure. This kind of visual layering speaks to the impermanence of corporate identities and the way history is both obscured and revealed over time, if you know where to look. To further connect the piece to its historical roots, I have integrated pages from Penn Central's bankruptcy filing into the composition. The textual elements serve as both artifacts and commentary, emphasizing how financial and corporate decisions shape not only the railroads themselves, but also the landscapes, industries, and communities that they touch. Through this work, I examine how we construct meaning from the past, questioning what is remembered, what is erased, and of course, what is left behind. So with this image, I'm still thinking about heritage identity and railroads, though not through a designated heritage unit, um, but through the complex relationship between the Illinois Central and the Canadian National Railroad. In 1999, The Canadian National acquired the Illinois Central, absorbing it into its vast network, kind of becoming the first kind of continental railroad. This shift reflects a broader pattern in the railroad industry where regional lines, once deeply tied to specific landscapes and economies, are gradually folded into larger corporate structure, often at the cost of their unique identities. So here I reintroduced the Illinois Central slogan, Main Line of Mid-America. I use that as the title, but it's dominated by a Canadian national locomotive. I feel like this juxtaposition invites reflection on how corporate mergers reshape not only infrastructure, but also the cultural narratives that surround railroads. Included within this image are pictures of corn kind of woven into the composition. As a staple crop of Illinois and the broader Midwest, you'll find corn all over the Midwest. Corn serves as both a literal and a symbolic representation of the region Illinois Central once was defined by. Integrating this together, the work underscores the deep ties between railroads, agriculture, and regional identity. To further ground the piece in a historical context, I've incorporated pages from a lawsuit involving the Illinois Central Railroad. These textual fragments add another layer of meaning, hinting at the legal, financial, and operational struggles that accompany corporate shifts. Through this work, I seek to examine not just the visual legacy of railroads, but the broader implications of their evolution. Again, how history is preserved, interpreted, or erased in the wake of progress. Since we began this journey by exploring images inspired by the Louisiana Delta Railroad, it seems only fitting to conclude with these works that pay tribute to the source of inspiration that we began with. This piece is the first of two for this final segment, and this one is called Louisiana Delta. The color palette is drawn primarily from the railroad's signature hues, evoking the distinct presence of its locomotives against the South Louisiana landscape. Both engines depicted here reflect scenes that are familiar and deeply rooted in the region's visual and cultural identity. Layers of text are interwoven into this composition, and for here they come from a land use case in New Iberia, which is again is the corporate headquarters for the Louisiana Delta. This adds another dimension of history, law, and place to the piece. I find that the fusion of this image and the text underscores the way in which industry, environment, and legal frameworks intersect, shaping both the land and the communities that depend on it. This image is titled Zero, a direct reference to the bold Zero logo prominently displayed on several Louisiana Delta locomotives. So when I first noticed the Zero, I sort of assumed that it was related to emissions. But later I discovered its true meaning. If you look closely at the Zero, it's got text underneath it that says zero injuries, our goal every day. So this is kind of a statement meant to reflect the railroad's commitment to safety, emphasizing a culture where every worker's well-being is the top priority. The color palette remains consistent with the railroad's distinctive orange and yellow hues, kind of reinforcing the visual identity of Louisiana and Delta, a very familiar sight if you live in Louisiana. Torg fragments are deliberately integrated into the composition, again symbolizing the railroad's unique history. It's a history built from the remnants of various former lines now woven together in a single operation. The layering of these elements echoes the way the past and present converge in the railroad's identity. I also titled this piece Zero because I liked the idea of zero meaning nothing, and then an image, obviously, with several somethings. There's what, 4 or 5 locomotives depicted here, so I liked that little piece of contrast. I've also integrated pages from land use, that same land use case in New Iberia, into this one. Again, looking at the corporate headquarters of Louisiana Delta and using the textual elements as a reminder of the legal and environmental considerations that shaped the region and grounding people in a sense of history and place. So that concludes my presentation. Again, the in-person exhibition will be held at the Livingston Parish Public Library in Springfield, Louisiana. We do have some time for some questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask those or type those into the chat. I do see that someone has asked how moving to Louisiana has shaped how I see and interpret railroads. That's an interesting question. I would have to say what immediately jumps out is this idea of the commodities that you see shipped. There's a lot more oil trains that go through. There's a lot more cane products being shipped by rail. So um, there's a real difference in the kinds of trains that you see that I hadn't seen growing up in the Midwest. But also, I think there's a difference in the way the railroad is built onto the land. Going back to this relationship between the railroad and the land, Louisiana is very flat, and there are a lot of railroad right of ways that are very flat. You think of railroad tracks as being kind of built up on a mound. There are several lines here in Louisiana that the tracks are even with the land that you're standing on. It's kind of unusual. I haven't really seen anything like that anywhere else. So I think that's something that's unique to Louisiana. Just the way that the trains are following the contours of the land, forming that intimate relationship between the land and the trains and the communities that they serve and kind of the history and all that. I think that's kind of interesting. Any other questions? All right. Well, please do look for more information regarding the exhibition of this in May and check social media for more information about me and my work. Thank you so much for coming.